In August 1945, two young American colonels sat in a room in Washington with about 30 minutes to decide the future of Korea. They had no maps of the country, no experts, no advisors, just a wall map ripped out of a National Geographic magazine and a pencil. One of them was named Dean Rusk. He would later become Secretary of State. The other was Charles Bonesteel. Neither of them had ever been to Korea. Neither spoke the language. Neither knew a single person who lived there. They picked a line across the middle of the country, the 38th parallel, mostly because it cut the map roughly in half and kept the capital, Seoul, on the American side. They figured the Soviets would never agree to it anyway. 30 minutes. Two men. A magazine map. That line is still there today. It is the most heavily armed border on the planet, separating two countries that share 1,000 years of history, the same language, the same food, the same ancestors, and somehow ended up as bitter enemies. One side has skyscrapers, K-pop, and some of the richest companies on Earth. The other has famine, missiles, and one of the most extreme dictatorships in human history. So how does that even happen? How do you take a single nation that survived Mongol invasions, Japanese occupation, and centuries of foreign pressure, and rip it apart so cleanly that 80 years later it still cannot heal? To understand that, we have to go back, way back before the colonels, before the war, to a kingdom that for most of its history was fiercely, stubbornly united. For most of its history, Korea was one country, not two, one. A single kingdom stretching from the icy mountains in the north down to the warm southern coast, with one king, one language, and a culture that had been simmering for thousands of years. The Koreans had their own alphabet, their own food, their own way of doing things, and they were very protective of all of it. For centuries, outsiders called Korea the Hermit Kingdom because it tried so hard to stay closed off from the world. The Koreans had watched their neighbors get pushed around by foreigners and decided, no thanks, we will sit this one out. The problem was geography. Korea is a small peninsula squeezed between three giants, China on one side, Russia just to the north, Japan right across the water. Three of the most ambitious powers in Asian history, all staring at the same little stretch of land. For most of Korean history, China was the big brother. Korea paid tribute, copied Chinese writing, borrowed Chinese ideas, and in return China mostly left them alone. It was not a perfect deal, but it worked. Then in the 1800s, the world changed. Western ships started showing up everywhere with cannons and steam engines. Japan, watching all this, made a wild decision. Instead of resisting the West, they would copy it. They built factories, modern armies, modern navies, and within about 30 years they went from a feudal backwater to a serious military power. Then they looked around for someone to flex on. Their eyes landed on the closest target, the peninsula sitting right next door, Korea. In 1910, Japan officially annexed Korea, just took it. The Korean king was forced to sign his own country away, and overnight, Korea stopped being a country at all. It became a colony, and not a gentle one. The Japanese were not interested in sharing power or respecting Korean culture. They wanted to erase it. Korean schools were forced to teach in Japanese. Korean newspapers were shut down. Korean families were ordered to take Japanese names. Speaking Korean in public could get you beaten. Even praying at the wrong shrine could get you arrested. Land was confiscated from Korean farmers and handed to Japanese settlers. Factories were built to feed the Japanese war machine, and Koreans were the cheap labor that ran them. Then it got worse. During World War II, hundreds of thousands of Korean men were dragged off to work in mines and factories across the Japanese Empire. Tens of thousands of Korean women were forced into military brothels, a horror the world is still arguing about today. A whole generation grew up being told that their language was inferior, their history was a lie, and their country had never really existed. Some Koreans collaborated with the Japanese to survive or get ahead. Others ran. A man named Syngman re-fled to America and spent decades lobbying anyone who would listen for Korean independence. Another man, Kim Il-sung, slipped across the border into Manchuria and joined armed guerrilla groups fighting the Japanese in the mountains. Two men, two very different paths, and neither of them knew it yet, but they were each about to inherit half of a broken country. Then in August 1945, it all came crashing down. The Americans dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan. The Soviets, who had promised to help finish the war in Asia, suddenly poured across the border into Japanese-held territory. Within days, the mighty Japanese empire that had crushed Korea for 35 years collapsed like a wet paper bag. Koreans all over the peninsula heard the news and went absolutely wild. People poured into the streets crying, hugging strangers, waving flags they had hidden in their attics for decades. After 35 years of occupation, Korea was free. Or at least, that is what they thought. The problem was that nobody had actually planned what to do with Korea after Japan lost. The Allies had spent years arguing about Germany, about France, about the Pacific Islands, but Korea was an afterthought. A small peninsula nobody in Washington really cared about. And now the Japanese troops they needed to surrender to someone, and the Soviets were already pouring in from the north at terrifying speed. That is when those 2 American colonels, Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel, got pulled into a room at the War Department on a hot August night. Their orders were simple. Pick a line. Somewhere on the map of Korea, pick a line where the Americans would accept Japanese surrender on the south side and the Soviets would accept it on the north. They had 30 minutes. They grabbed a National Geographic map off the wall. They looked for something obvious. There was no river, no mountain range, nothing natural that split the country evenly, so they just picked a latitude, the 38th parallel. To their complete surprise, the Soviets said yes, just like that. Stalin, who could have easily marched all the way down and grabbed the whole peninsula before the Americans even arrived, simply agreed to stop at the line. Nobody fully understands why. Some historians think he was being cautious, others think he was saving his energy for Europe, others think he genuinely believed the division would only be temporary. Whatever the reason, Soviet troops halted at the 38th parallel and waited. American troops did not even arrive in Korea until almost a month later, in September 1945, and when they finally showed up, they were spectacularly unprepared. The general in charge, John Hodge, was a competent battlefield commander, but he knew nothing about Korea. He had been sent because his units happened to be the closest available. His soldiers spoke no Korean. They had no Korean translators. They had no plan for what to do with a country they had just inherited. So they made a decision that infuriated almost every Korean alive. They kept the Japanese colonial officials in place. The same officials who had beaten Koreans, stolen their land, and crushed their culture were now sitting in the same offices, just answering to Americans instead of Tokyo. The Americans figured it would be easier to keep the existing system running for a while. To Koreans, it felt like being liberated and then handed right back to their abusers. Meanwhile, in the north, the Soviets were doing something very different. They were not keeping the old system at all. They were quietly handpicking a young guerrilla fighter to be the face of their new Korea. His name was Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung was 33 years old. He had spent most of the war fighting the Japanese in the mountains of Manchuria, then escaped to the Soviet Union, where he joined the Red Army and earned the trust of his Soviet handlers. He was young, tough, charismatic, and most importantly, he took orders. When Soviet officers brought him back to a town in northern Korea in September 1945, almost nobody had heard of him. He gave a speech that fell completely flat. People expected a legendary old freedom fighter and got a kid in a borrowed suit. But the Soviets did not care. They had picked their man. They would build him up. Down south, the Americans were dealing with their own political headache. Syngman Rhee, the old exile, came flying back from the United States after spending 40 years abroad. He was 70 years old, fiercely anti-communist, fluent in English, and convinced he was destined to rule. The Americans were not thrilled with him, but he was the most prominent Korean nationalist they had, and at least he spoke their language. Both halves of Korea now had a leader installed by foreigners. Both leaders claimed to speak for the entire Korean people. Both leaders hated each other before they had ever even met. And ordinary Koreans, who had spent decades dreaming of independence, watched in growing horror as their country was carved up between two superpowers who did not understand it and did not really care to. Protests broke out. Strikes erupted. In the south, American troops opened fire on demonstrators more than once. In the north, Anyone who criticized the new system started disappearing. By 1948, both sides gave up pretending. The North declared itself the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, with Kim Il-sung as its leader. The South declared itself the Republic of Korea, with Syngman Rhee as its president. Two countries, one peninsula, two governments, both claiming to be the only real Korea, both planning, eventually, to take the other half by force. The Soviets pulled their troops out of the North, but they left behind tanks, artillery, fighter planes, and thousands of advisors. The Americans pulled most of their troops out of the South, but left behind a much weaker force, mostly light weapons, no tanks, no real air power. They did not trust Syngman Rhee not to start a war the second he had the means to do it. That asymmetry would matter very soon. Then in June 1950, Kim Il-sung made his move. He had been begging Stalin for permission to invade the South for over a year. Stalin kept saying no. Then suddenly, with the communists having just won the civil war in China, Stalin changed his mind. Sure, he said, go ahead. Just do not expect Soviet troops to bail you out. On June 25, 1950, at 4 in the morning, North Korean tanks rolled across the 38th parallel. Within 3 days, they had captured Seoul. The South Korean army, lightly armed and caught completely by surprise, collapsed almost immediately. American advisors who had been sleeping in their barracks woke up to find a full-scale invasion underway. In Washington, President Truman was eating dinner when he got the call. He put down his fork. He knew exactly what this meant. Truman did not even wait for Congress. He ordered American troops to Korea immediately and got the United Nations to authorize an international force. Within weeks, soldiers from 16 countries were pouring into the peninsula, most of them American, all of them under the command of General Douglas MacArthur. But by the time they arrived, North Korean troops had pushed almost all the way to the southern tip of Korea. The defenders were squeezed into a tiny corner around the city of Busan, fighting for their lives. Then MacArthur did something audacious. Instead of slugging his way north from Busan, he loaded a massive force onto ships and landed them at Incheon, a port halfway up the peninsula, right behind the North Korean army. It was an incredibly risky move. The tides at Incheon were brutal. Most of his own generals told him it would fail. It did not fail. The landing worked. North Korean forces, suddenly cut off from their supply lines, collapsed. United Nations troops pushed north fast. They retook Seoul. They crossed the 38th parallel. They kept going. They captured the North Korean capital, Pyongyang. Kim Il-sung fled north toward the Chinese border. It looked like the war was almost over. And then China entered the war. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers came pouring across the Yalu River in human waves, blowing bugles and screaming. American troops, who had been told they would be home by Christmas, suddenly found themselves outnumbered in freezing mountains, fighting an enemy they had not even known was coming. The retreat that followed was one of the worst in American military history. For 3 more brutal years, the war ground on. Up the peninsula, down the peninsula, back up again, back down again. American bombers flattened nearly every city in North Korea. Some estimates say more bombs were dropped on Korea than on all of the Pacific Theater during World War II. Entire towns ceased to exist. Pyongyang was reduced to rubble. Civilians on both sides were caught in the middle, freezing in winter, starving in summer, watching armies trample through their villages over and over. Millions died. Nobody knows the exact number. Some say 2 million, some say 3, some say more. Whole families were wiped out. Refugees streamed in every direction. By 1953, both sides were exhausted. The front line had basically settled right back where it started, near the 38th parallel. The same line 2 American colonels had drawn on a magazine map 8 years earlier was now a line of trenches, barbed wire and corpses. In July of that year, the 2 sides signed an armistice, not a peace treaty, just a ceasefire. They agreed to stop shooting, draw a buffer zone called the demilitarized zone, and go home. Technically, the Korean War never ended. It just paused, and that pause has lasted more than 70 years. The demilitarized zone became the most heavily armed border on the planet, 2.5 miles wide, packed with mines, watchtowers, and soldiers staring at each other through binoculars. Families who had been visiting relatives on the other side when the war broke out never saw each other again. Brothers, sisters, parents, children, all separated forever by a line nobody asked for. What happened next is almost impossible to believe. The two Koreas, starting from the same ruined peninsula in 1953, took completely opposite paths. South Korea, despite years of dictatorship and chaos, slowly built itself into one of the richest countries in the world. Samsung, Hyundai, LG, K-pop, Korean cinema, Korean food, all of it exploding onto the global stage. A country that in 1953 was poorer than most of Africa is now wealthier than most of Europe. North Korea went the other direction. Kim Il-sung built a system designed to keep his family in power forever. His son Kim Jong-il took over when he died. Then his grandson Kim Jong-un took over from him. 3 generations of one family ruling one country like a private kingdom. Famines killed hundreds of thousands. Prison camps swallowed anyone who stepped out of line. The country became one of the most isolated places on Earth, surviving on Chinese aid and the threat of its growing nuclear arsenal. And the families separated by that line in 1945 are still separated today. Some elderly Koreans, now in their 80s and 90s, have spent their entire lives hopping to see a brother or sister on the other side just one more time. Most of them never will. All of it traces back to 30 minutes in a room in Washington, 2 colonels, a magazine map, a pencil line that was supposed to be temporary. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Drop a comment below telling me which country you want me to cover next. See you in the next story.